You're going to have 2 men at the front of the stretcher party. Lads, I want to see this at all times.
Slava Ukraini!
One of the turning points in European history is unfolding. What was once merely a possibility is now being mapped out on military charts. European troops are preparing to enter Ukrainian territory. This is not merely about defending Kyiv. It is a move to rebuild Europe's own security architecture for the first time since World War II. Neither neutrality nor distant condemnations are deemed sufficient anymore.
European leaders are holding follow-up meetings after Monday's summit with US President Donald Trump and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky.
Governments are issuing warning messages, and lights in military headquarters remain on until dawn. Units formed under the leadership of France and the United Kingdom are standing by, non-NATO but collective, independent but coordinated. This is not just a military deployment, but a strategic message directed at Moscow. Will this move stop the war, or will it ignite a new European front? Western support, which for years has been limited to economic sanctions, arms shipments and intelligence sharing, is now hitting the ground. As diplomatic contacts behind the scenes come to light, the phrase, "about 10 countries," is moving from the corridors to official briefings. At the core of the plan is the idea of a multinational European force to be deployed in Ukraine following a peace agreement. Sources say that British and French troops will play a central role, with other European allies contributing at various levels. This framework is being designed as a coalition of the willing, rather than under the NATO umbrella, with technical details being finalized in coordination with Washington. The political message is clear. It is no longer just about sending ammunition, but about showing a physical presence on the ground. It is now clear that the red line of no troops has been redrawn. This redrawing corresponds to Europe's decision to directly protect its own security interests on the ground. So, what variable in Moscow's calculations will such a presence affect the fastest? The answer lies in the capacity of European troops to establish a deterrent balance within Ukraine's borders. Looking at national motivations, the picture becomes clearer, and geography speaks for itself. The Baltic capitals and Warsaw see the threat just beyond their borders and understand the concrete costs of delay. For Central European countries such as Slovakia and the Czech Republic, establishing a defense line beyond the Dniester is a strategic gain. On the southern flank, Romania is placing this debate at the center of its security agenda due to Black Sea security and energy infrastructure risks. In Western Europe, Paris and London are taking the lead with political will and combining military capacity with political determination. The Netherlands and Denmark have the expertise in air and logistics to contribute to the post-war security implementation file. Italy's contribution is being discussed in the areas of maritime security and training logistics, with a flexible package formula emerging as a key element. The common denominator in this mosaic is the reality that the deterrence chain in Europe would break if Ukraine falls. The way to prevent this is through the cautious but genuine deployment of military forces. For this reason, the scope of the mission and the command structure are being discussed before the number of troops. The planned force is not being conceived as an attack army to be deployed to the front lines, but rather as a force to enforce peace and ensure infrastructure security. The mission definition emphasizes monitoring the ceasefire line, protecting critical facilities, and reducing the risk of sabotage. The management of humanitarian corridors, mine clearance, and the security of reconstruction areas are defined as the second major heading. This scenario requires not passive observers, but a force that is equipped, trained, and operates under clear rules of engagement. France's emphasis on presence outside hot conflict zones reflects its aim to establish a security cordon without risking deterrence. The same approach allows for training and advisory missions to be carried out inside Ukraine and along the front lines. Such a presence, when combined with air defense and electronic warfare support, would serve as a real shield. The significance of the shield on the ground is that it would instantly raise the political and military costs of a Russian attack. It is precisely this increase in costs that will create a difference in Moscow's perception. Therefore, the question of how to stand is as central to operational plans as the question of where to stand. When it comes to the scale of the operation, historical examples are useful but cannot be replicated. The missions in Bosnia and Kosovo required deployments measured in the tens of thousands, and the geography was more confined. Ukraine, however, presents a completely different scale in terms of land area, population, and critical infrastructure density. Therefore, for real deterrence, a flexible force of at least 20,000 to 30,000 personnel seems reasonable in the first phase. This presence must be made sustainable through a distributed model and rotation plan based on the type of unit. A centralized command structure is essential because a fragmented command chain leads to tactical confusion on the ground. An advanced headquarters in Kyiv, combined with a logistics administrative center in Warsaw or Rzeszów, is one of the most rational options. The field headquarters points to a three-tiered architecture, with observation elements close to the ceasefire line and training maintenance bases in the rear. This architecture provides flexibility and ease of task transfer at moments of political decision-making. Each tier must ensure civil-military coordination and coordination with international agencies through procedures. The US parameter is critical for this plan to succeed, but its formal limits are clear. The entry of ground forces into Ukraine is not on the agenda, and Washington is sticking to this line. In contrast, US support in areas such as air defense, intelligence, reconnaissance and air resupply is on the table. This support directly increases the quality and survivability of European forces on the ground. AWACS, tanker and satellite ISR integration make the security umbrella visible in peacekeeping areas. On the political level, the dual formula of American air umbrella, European ground presence simplifies the language of deterrence. In response to Moscow's claim that the West has entered the field, the mission's non-NATO coalition nature preserves the principal distinction. This distinction aims to reduce the risk of miscalculation in the escalation ladder and strengthen control mechanisms. The message conveyed at the leadership level is that military presence and political resolve will be demonstrated together to preserve peace. If this balance can be established, force can achieve maximum psychological impact with minimal engagement. No plan can stand without a legal framework, and three layers stand out in this case. First, host nation agreements with Ukraine and protocols on the status of forces. Second, the constitution and parliamentary approval processes of each country sending troops. Third, an umbrella agreement regulating the transfer of authority, discipline, jurisdiction, and compensation within the coalition. These layers should be accompanied by standard operating procedures governing civil-military cooperation. The peacekeeping nature of the force emphasizes the principles of defense priority and proportionality in the rules of engagement. Nevertheless, the force's authority to use force against elements threatening itself or the facilities it protects should be clearly stated. Clear lines of authority in tasks such as infrastructure protection, crowd control, and EOD mine clearance reduce disputes. Practices that reduce the risk of civilian casualties are the practical expression of legal legitimacy on the ground. When legitimacy is well established, political consent and public support become sustainable. The logistical picture relies on a lifeline established through Poland and Slovakia. Railway lines serve as the main artery for heavy vehicles and ammunition, and route security is tested daily. The Rzeszów airport and surrounding bases have long been the backbone of Ukraine's logistics. The field medical chain must be redesigned from scratch, including advanced medical points and air-ground medevac procedures. A decentralized scheme should be preferred to avoid making depots, maintenance, and supply nodes single targets. Fuel and spare parts planning must be redundant, taking into account Russia's hybrid sabotage tactics. Convoy security is reinforced with armored escorts against electronic jamming and unmanned threats. As rotation periods shorten, fatigue and error margins decrease and mission quality improves. Field reality repeatedly proves that even the best logistics plan can be challenged. Therefore, a logistics scheme without a backup plan cannot be trusted. Air defense layers must be an integral part of the deployment plan for force protection. The threat spectrum is broad and dynamic, ranging from low-altitude drones to cruise missiles. Portable systems, short to medium-range batteries, and allied contributions in the upper layer must converge on a single network. Field radars, passive sensors, and optical systems provide early warning even in urban environments. Command and control software must be integrated with Ukrainian networks through a tactical interface. Friend or foe identification is the only reliable way to prevent errors in a crowded air picture. Electronic warfare cells are positioned at the front line to disrupt and redirect incoming waves. Passive protection and concrete steel shields reduce risks at vulnerable fixed points. All of this increases the likelihood of the force surviving without engaging in combat. A surviving force produces the highest deterrence and supports the political objective. If the mission profile is broad but focused, efficiency increases and unnecessary risks decrease. Ceasefire line surveillance produces a continuous picture using observation towers and sensor networks. Infrastructure protection is planned to cover electricity, water, railways, and port nodes. Explosive ordnance disposal, mine clearance, and UXO collection teams rapidly enter residential areas. Joint security patrols with civil administration create a visible shield around reconstruction sites. Training for local personnel assigned to critical facilities ensures the transfer of permanent capacity. Cyber defense cells accelerate basic hygiene and incident response in municipal and national networks. Countering disinformation in the information environment is conducted through a verification line from a single command center. All these tasks are planned not with a zero-loss goal, but with the principle of risk-minimized execution. The success of the plan lies not in enthusiastic rhetoric, but in disciplined execution. Moscow's possible responses should be read through 3 channels and based on data, not emotion. A direct attack on European unions carries the risk of open conflict with NATO and is unlikely. Indirectly, however, an intensification of missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities can be expected. Infrastructure targets may come under pressure again as winter approaches, and an energy attrition strategy may be implemented. Within Europe, hybrid methods, cyber attacks, and sabotage attempts against critical supply chains may increase. In the political arena, disinformation campaigns aimed at creating divisions among coalition members will escalate. Belarus may be used more actively to create pressure on the northern front. Nuclear rhetoric may be used more loudly to psychologically raise the threshold for escalation. However, the erosion of credibility increases the cost of constant threats over time and reduces their impact. Therefore, coalition communication must remain clear, consistent, and address risks in advance. Testing possible scenarios on the ground in advance reduces surprises and minimizes damage. In a scenario where the ceasefire holds, forces build confidence through routine patrols and infrastructure protection. As local administrative capacity increases, the gradual transfer of responsibilities accelerates and the military presence becomes less visible. In a scenario where the ceasefire breaks down, force protection becomes a priority and withdrawal plans are implemented. These plans clearly define the limits of the rules of engagement and the evacuation chain. In the second stage, the peacekeeping force is redeployed without coming under pressure. On the political level, the cost of violations is recorded with concrete data and brought to the table. Recording and transparency are the fastest ways to generate international consent against the party responsible for the violation. The credibility of the force is measured by the discipline it demonstrates in times of crisis. Discipline is the real source of deterrence and enhances the power of the message. The economic front is the hidden but critical aspect of this plan. The European defense industry must achieve a sustainable pace in the production of ammunition and spare parts. Budget debates, election schedules, and social spending will compete with this plan and test its political backbone. Volatility in energy prices may affect the public's patience threshold and determine the tone of communication. This pressure may fuel expectations of short-term, big impact, but realism demands a long-term approach. Common standards and joint procurement pools in defense procurement reduce costs. Maintenance and repair at joint bases lower the total cost of ownership of forces. In the long term, these steps will translate Europe's strategic autonomy into real inventory. If there is no gap between inventory and will, the credibility of the deterrence narrative will increase. When credibility increases, the goal of the force on the ground becomes more peace with fewer bullets. Regional repercussions are enlarging the map before decision makers and pointing to new risks. The Moldova and Transnistria file is creating a fragile fault line along the southern flank. Pressure from Belarus is being reassessed in the Suwalki corridor equation for Poland and the Baltics. Air and sea patrols around Kaliningrad require extra coordination to prevent communication accidents. In the Black Sea, the Montreux regime limits maritime movement while prioritizing maneuverability in the air. As a result, air defense is becoming a practical extension of maritime security and offers a cost-effective solution. Energy infrastructure in the southern corridor must be linked to common procedures against sabotage and cyber threats. These procedures will remain on paper without civil-private sector cooperation. A small error on the map can easily turn into a major crisis on the ground. This is why detail is the real insurance of strategy. For Ukraine, this plan means more than military reinforcement. It is an opportunity to breathe. Behind the front lines, training, personnel rotation, and equipment maintenance become more systematic. Protecting critical infrastructure reduces energy and water shortages and restores the rhythm of daily life. A security belt in reconstruction areas facilitates the return of investment and the private sector. Documenting war crimes adds an element of trust to the international chain of evidence. The return of refugees is directly proportional to the perception of security, and such deployments lower the psychological threshold. In the long term, this picture accelerates Ukraine's national defense transformation. NATO standard training and logistical discipline support the army's doctrinal leap. This leap is a prerequisite for securing a permanent place in the post-war security architecture. In short, presence on the ground not only protects today but also builds tomorrow. From the Kremlin's perspective, the greatest loss is the erosion of the narrative's power, which is a political risk. For years, the slogan, "The West is already on the ground," has filled propaganda screens. When Europe enters the military arena, the rhetoric will be tested by reality, and the domestic public will ask a new question. If the West was already on the ground, why is this step now changing the moral superiority? This question is an unpleasant chess move for the elite coalition. The weakening of the energy card and the increase in defense imports also accelerate this erosion. The prolongation of the war, the increase in costs, and the uncertainty of the goal challenge internal legitimacy. As the difficulty increases, the tone of the nuclear rhetoric rises, but its credibility declines. When rhetoric does not find a real counterpart, deterrence erodes and backfires. Therefore, the Kremlin's most rational option is to control the escalation and open space for negotiations. The implementation timetable must be realistic and proceed step by step. The first stage is political consensus and the framing of force contributions in a framework agreement. The second stage is the completion of technical talks on status agreements, command structures, and rules of engagement. The third stage is the preparation of forward bases, the testing of logistical corridors, and the deployment of small advance elements. The fourth stage is the commencement of observation and infrastructure protection tasks with the declaration of a ceasefire. The fifth stage is the gradual expansion of the mission area and the transfer of capacity to local actors. A public timetable and transparent reporting at each stage will keep political consent fresh. Concrete milestones for parliamentary votes will increase the power of persuasion. Cost sharing, managed through joint funding and procurement programs, reduces objections. Most importantly, if an exit strategy is written from day one, the mission does not become an open-ended commitment. The critical distinction now is that this plan is not a NATO operation but the collective will of NATO countries. This distinction aims to undermine Moscow's "NATO is fighting us" propaganda. Coalition flexibility takes into account the national constraints and political calendars of participants. Contribution scales may vary, but the mission definition and discipline remain common. The US providing air and intelligence cover without deploying ground forces maintains the balance. Europe's ground presence normalizes daily life in protected areas and makes deterrence visible on the ground. This dual formula produces the highest probability of benefit in the risk-return calculation. Of course, this formula is not perfect and will be tested. At times of testing, discipline and transparency prevent breakdown and keep support intact. Otherwise, a well-intentioned project will overshoot its objectives on the ground. The question is whether Europe can politically carry this step forward and how long this will last. When losses occur, public opinion fluctuates and inter-party debate intensifies. Economic waves, energy bills, and budget deficits add numbers to the file. Despite all these variables, establishing a security architecture outside is a prerequisite for comfort inside. The role of politics is to explain this reality in simple and accurate terms. Accurate statements transparently show where money and risk are being allocated. Transparency reduces divisive debates and strengthens social consent. When consent persists, small crises in the field do not turn into major political ruptures. When they do not, the task is carried out as planned and yields results step by step. When it yields results, the chance for peace to become permanent becomes real. Europe's decision to deploy its own troops for its own security marks a threshold in continental politics. For decades, Europe has consumed security under the US umbrella, but now, for the first time, it is embarking on large-scale risk sharing. This sharing aims to test Russia's likelihood of attack not in a single capital, but in the resolve of a bloc. For the Kremlin, this new equation means more red columns in the cost-benefit table. For Ukraine, it means breathing space, reconstruction, and lasting deterrence. The support provided by the US from the air is amplifying the order established by Europe on the ground. This framework is the most rational way to achieve maximum impact with minimal engagement on the ground. Of course, there are risks, and these are not denied, but when risks are manageable, opportunities grow. The opportunity is not just to stop this war, but to build a new security architecture on the ground. Europe will not remain a spectator. This time, it will stand at the center of the field to protect its own future and bear the cost. What are your thoughts on this issue? Your opinions are very important to us. Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for watching.